a botanical club the last Monday of every month. We encourage you to come and check it out. We will be featuring Beronda's book in February, so if you want to read the book and come discuss it with us at the end of February, please join us. Just a few housekeeping things. The exit is down that way. Restrooms are out these double doors and down the hallway. I'm going to let Jan do some introductions, and then we'll get started, and we'll do some more book sales and signing afterwards.
All righty, welcome to this wonderful first book talk that we are co-hosting with the Botanical Center. Before we begin, I want to do a little advertising because that's what I do at Real Books. And tomorrow night, we have Josiah Hesse at the store to share his book, On Fire for God. That's at 6:30. And then on Friday, we have Grant Faulkner, and he's going to talk about his very unique novel. It's called Something Out There in the Distance, and that will also be at 6:30, so you can find all the details on our website. And if you love to read and you love to meet authors, be sure to check out the website or sign up for our newsletter, because we have lots of programs. Now, on to tonight. The history of trees in America are also the histories of Black Americans. Pecan trees were domesticated by an enslaved African named Antoine. Sycamore trees were both havens and signposts for people trying to escape enslavement. Poplar trees are historically associated with lynching, and willow bark has offered the gift of medicine. In When Trees Testify, award-winning plant biologist Beronda L. Montgomery explores the way 7 trees, as well as the cotton shrub, are intertwined with Black history and culture. She reveals how knowledge surrounding these trees has shaped America since the very beginning. And as she shows, trees are material witnesses to the lives of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Beronda is an award-winning plant biologist and the author of the acclaimed Lessons from Plants. She's been named one of the journal's Cell's 100 Inspiring Black Scientists in America and was awarded the 2021 Cynthia Westcott Science Writing Award and the 2022 Adolph E. Good Jr. Award for Outstanding Service to the Science of Plant Biology. She was named a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University and is a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Society of Plant Biologists, the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and the American Academy of Microbiology. Whew. And she lives right here in Des Moines.
Black women have to work twice as hard.
And wear heels, right?
And wear heels,
Yes. Okay. Joining Beronda tonight is John T. Price. We're thrilled to have him here too. He's the author of Ghost Oak, a Holocaust story. John is a native of Fort Dodge, and he attended the University of Iowa, where he earned a BA in religion, an MFA in nonfiction writing, and a PhD in English. We have so many smart people here. He has authored 5 creative nonfiction books, often using humor to explore the wildish intersections of nature, family, community, and spirit, with a special love for the prairies and oaklands of his Midwestern home. The titles are All Is Leaf, Essays and Transformations, Daddy Longlegs, The Natural Education of a Father, Man Killed by Pheasant, my personal favorite, and Other Kinships, and Not Just Any Land, a personal and literary journey into the American grasslands. He's also the editor of The Tallgrass Prairie Reader, the first historical collection of nature writing entirely dedicated to the beauty and fragility of the tallgrass region. So, I'm going to turn it over to John. He's got a lot of questions, I know, and thanks again for coming. We'll be selling the books after the program, and enjoy.
We decided I would start with a brief reading. I just wanted to say it's a real joy to have familiar faces and new acquaintances here. And I'm really grateful that John was able to be here. I love, I told you, your book, Hurt is Gold. It was just so creative and actually helped me process the trauma of going through Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica. That's a story for another time. My son said I need to not overachieve and start with Hurricane level 5. So I'm going to read a couple of sections from the introduction, Life as Testimony, and then turn to a conversation, and then time for you all to ask questions as well. I should admit that in the winter of 2019, when I traveled to the McLeod Plantation historic site located on James Island in South Carolina, I was a reluctant visitor. I didn't want to go. That is the simple and entire truth. I didn't want to go for so many reasons, but one of those reasons is that I, like many other African Americans, still harbor a deep land trauma. That day, I feared that I would have to confront one of my greatest fears, that non-Black Americans who might not understand the deep and lasting trauma of chattel slavery to the enslaved and their descendants in the U.S. will be going about the land with joy and reckless curiosity rather than a deep appreciation for the disturbing but very real history that continued to soak the soils. My trepidation is not an unfounded fear. In America, former plantations are commonly the sites of weddings, parties, and more for those who see their physical beauty yet hold an ability to separate their physical attributes from the fact that these are sites of intergenerational trauma and exploitation. Plantations are indeed places of America's unsatisfactorily confronted, often actively turned away from, and still unresolved shame. Perhaps it is because these sites are the same as much of the South, about which scholar Imani Perry states, "It's just too pristine, knowing the blood in the soil." Left to my own devices, I surely would have never gone to visit a plantation. But my frequent and mostly joyous travels with my son Nicholas and best friend and sister Renee include excursions that are the priority selection of each one of us. Having visited flower and botanic gardens of my choosing in the days before the day trip to the former plantation, my traveling companions, who happen to both be Black history buffs, now wanted to visit McLeod and another plantation site in Charleston, and there was absolutely no dissuading them. When I tried to avert these plantation visits, they reminded me of their patience with me as I spoke endlessly, their words, certainly not mine, about each flower, plant, and tree that caught my eye at the botanical gardens. I unsuccessfully tried to get them to see that this was different for me. But as frequently happens, my own child joined forces with his beloved aunt, and I lost the battle. Believe me, I gave all my best arguments, and yet they persisted, indeed insisted. When my family and I arrived at the McLeod site, the day was overcast. We could smell the rain in the air. I did not actively summon the rain. However, I did expectantly, even hopefully wonder if it might result in a canceled tour. So I spoke to the delaying rain and said, "You are welcome here." My traveling companions were not amused. Like my grandmother before her, my sister reminded me that those were thoughts that I was welcome to think inside of myself. As we left the visitor center and rounded the path to the main entry of the plantation to await the full group to assemble for the guided tour with the cultural history interpreter, my son and I broke off from the slowly gathering visitors. Renee, with her ever-present camera in tow, went her own way. Nicholas and I quietly approached the big house directly in front of us, accompanied by the crunching sound of gravel on the dry, dusty ground beneath our feet. As we began our journey around the grounds, we glanced first at the restored original cotton gin to the left. This gin reminded me of the countless stories that my mother and father shared about their upbringing in segregated Jim Crow Arkansas. An upbringing that included picking cotton for harvest, but also my mother discovering a love for school and learning. Indeed, although I'm the first professor in my family in a different world, my brilliant mom might have been the first. She loved math and is still quick with numbers. To this day, none of us ever try to short her on her change. Yet she and my father grew up a mere few generations removed from our ancestral family who had been enslaved. Though my parents were born free Black Americans post-emancipation in the early 1940s, their freedom still had severe limitations. Their already separate and unequal education was also routinely interrupted. They were unable to go regularly to school for an entire school year, or their school years were shortened by design, according to the local agricultural calendars. School frequently was disrupted for them and other Black children during cotton harvest season. During these times, Mom and Dad served as farm laborer alongside their parents, meaning that my mother was never able, as a child, to fully explore and cultivate her love of math and learning. Out of encountering this cotton gin that has set me down a path of recalling my parents' early years, my mind slowly drew back to the current moment of exploring the cotton grounds, the McLeod grounds. Outside in the quarters, the cotton fields with Sea Island cotton plants growing in them were directly ahead of us as we walked forward. These were agricultural fields whose prior fertility had supported the success of the plantation owners, based on the labor of those Africans and their descendants whom the McLeods enslaved. Just outside, I'm skipping around because I have a story I'm getting to and I want to talk to you. It sounds cohesive, right? That's good breathing.
Yes.
Just outside the McLeod cabins were fields where cotton and other plants were growing in demonstration fields. My son and I looked out at them for some time and discussed what the different plants might be as we waited together again with my sister and the rest of the group. Most notable and abundant were the Sea Island cotton plants, a version of cotton that is viewed as superior because it's extra long fibers that produce a very soft cotton fabric. As we were there in December, which is past cotton season, there were no visible cotton bolls in the field. I couldn't recall whether Nicholas had ever seen cotton in bloom, with its flowers presenting delicate white to yellow petals that can mature to pink, or bearing fully developed cotton in person. And I regret that he didn't get to see how stunningly beautiful a cotton plant can be, despite its infamous history. I turned away from the agricultural field, still reflecting on the roots of my Black botanical endeavors, and I was drawn to a massive tree directly ahead of me, the McLeod oak. The tour guide said that it was believed to be upward of 600 years old. Wow. I reverently approached the tree and stood beneath its broad, sweeping branches and gently rustling leaves, sinking into deep contemplation while my son ventured on. This beautifully unique being started as a single small acorn that sprouted into a small oak seedling. Each of the large curved branches would have emerged just during the years after the acorn sprouted, and the girth of each branch would have expanded year by year as the carbon dioxide taken up by the leaves was converted to sugars and then later to wood. Each twisting branch added to the beauty of the McLeod oak, especially during the increasingly blue sky that day. While presenting a beautiful form, each curve also represented the weight of the growing branch, causing it to go downward, before the tree would sense that and produce hormones to correct the growth back up. Each part of the tree documented its history, and I was honored to stand in his presence.
Well, it's an honor to be up here with you, and this is such a powerful, I told you before our get-together, a powerful, necessary book. And you and I met in the spring at another event in Omaha where you were the moderator, so you were my role model for tonight, so I hope I can live up to that standard that you created. At the time, Lessons from Plants had just come out, and I love that book, and if you haven't read that book, you need to get it. It's a phenomenal book, and we talked about this new book that was coming out. I was so excited about it, and I read and reread it. It's inspiring, it's informative, all these things that great nonfiction can do. So, but I thought I'd start at the beginning. Every book has a biography of sorts, and I'd like to hear where did the idea for this book start? Where did it go from there?
Yeah, so I read that section of the book because it started on that visit. And I love to tell that story because my son is now 23, and I talked to him yesterday. He called to tell me congratulations on the launch of the book that you didn't want to write, but you wrote it because Auntie Renee and I took you to.
I'm glad that happened.
Yeah. But it was standing at that tree right after the section that I read to you, standing with that tree. At some point, Renee and Nicholas come to stand with me, and I very matter-of-factly say, this tree holds the breath of our ancestors. And my sister just kind of stopped. They were both speechless. This is remarkable, that we are not a speechless crowd. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, we're exhaling carbon dioxide that gets taken up by the tree, converted to sugars, and some of those are used to build the wood. So our enslaved ancestors' breath is captured in the tree. So we're not just only standing with the same tree that they would have stood with, which is itself remarkable, to be able to stand with a living being. That's the same one your ancestors could have stood with. But you're standing with their captured breath. And for me, that was just a fact. But everyone, you know, people who aren't plant scientists find that, you know, like really quite remarkable. And so initially, as you might be aware, when a book comes out, you're often invited to write articles for magazines. So when Lessons from Plants came out, I was invited to write an article, and I wrote about the McLeod oak and thought it would just be an article. And then people started sharing with me about their trees. I started to encounter other trees, and I soon had a collection of species that I wanted to write about, intending only to write about the trees. And then I had this personal story and another personal story in another chapter. And my editor said, I think, do you have personal stories for most of the trees? And so it turned into this kind of collection of personal stories, true plant science, but also a deep connection to African American history, which I think, you know, we're at a time in our country where we are walking away from telling the full history of our nation. And when you walk away from telling that history, you're walking away from acknowledging people. And so it felt like a time to also use this unique perspective I had to try to contribute to a legacy of African American history in its different forms.
So
Not being a historian at all.
Well, you can fool me in this world because, you know, as a writing teacher, I'm just in awe of the way that you braid together science, personal narrative, history. This book to be taught in history classes, it can be taught in science classes, right? It can be taught in memoir classes. I will be teaching it. So I'm in awe of that ability. But I'm also a personal memoirist, and I was really, you know, drawn to the story of your family.
Yeah.
And also memory, right? Memory kind of links it all together. Personal, collective, you know, biological, botanical memory. But you dedicated this book to your mom, and I'd love to hear more about the role your parents played in nurturing your early love of science.
Yeah, so my first book, Lessons from Plants, came out in 2021. My father had passed away in 2019, so the first book was dedicated to him. This book was dedicated to my mom because both of my parents loved plants. My mother is just, her green thumb is amazing, but also she is in early stages of memory loss. And so it felt like a way to try to capture some of those memories. But it has also become the fact that the book is about science and history, I've also been thinking a lot about the science of memory, the history of memory. And while I'm watching biology erase her memory, and there's nothing we can do about that, I'm watching us as a country and a nation choose to erase memory, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And so in so many ways, it just felt like, I know I have more books in me, but this book felt like the book to dedicate to her. And of the greatest griefs I have, and there are lots of griefs to have in the world today, is that she's far enough in her memory loss. My mother was an avid reader, and she's no longer able to read and remember. And so the book is dedicated to her in so many different ways. But her love of plants and her ability to intuit and care for plants was something I didn't appreciate until I went to graduate school and came back to plants in a full circle way. So, yeah.
Well, and you know, one other powerful thing about the book too is that you make the argument implicitly in there that the sciences and the humanities has something important to offer one another. So I'd love to hear more about what they have to offer each other and why, you know, college campuses, as you know, often science is over here, the humanities over here, and how do we bring those two together, right? And why is it?
I think it's so critically important. So I have the gift of going back to, I was an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, which is not a traditional liberal arts school like Brunel College or some other in Iowa, but it has a liberal arts tradition. So I was majoring in biology and math, but had to take classes very broadly. So I took women's studies, and I took a couple of African American history classes, and just to be frank, almost all the black kids took those classes because it was our chance to have a black professor. And so, but then I fell in love with the African American history. But I took German, and all of my ability to understand science was enriched by bringing lessons from those other areas that I had studied. And also, I'm a storyteller. I come from there's a griot tradition in a lot of African countries where storytelling is the way the word gets passed. And so for me, the ability to tell a good story is so much a humanist perspective, a humanist way of being. And for a while, I got away from it. So after I left Washington University and went to graduate school, actually I didn't even leave Washington University. I was in a science class as a junior, and the professor wrote at the top of my paper, "You're never going to be a good scientist writing like this. This is such flowery writing. Like, you have to learn how to write technically." So then I went about trying to figure out how to write technically, and I'm not proud of it, but occasionally I can have what's known as a petty moment. So when Lessons from Plants came out, I sent him a signed copy. Because I think, that is an example of how we try to separate these things. Like we say to people, if you're a scientist, you have to think critically and talk exactly. And I'm often talking about love for plants. And I remember when I first started as a professor, a well-meaning mentor said, "You got to cut this out. Like, people aren't going to take you seriously as a scientist." And I said, "I'm a serious scientist, but I get to define serious." And I think that when we try to separate the humanities from the science, we only make silos, and silos don't ever get us where we need to be. So any chance that I think we can understand that science is a part of the living world, and understanding that fullness of the living world is a humanistic kind of approach. And so I decided that I get to define what a serious scientist is, and my greatest hope for being a scientist was never the awards. It was to try to understand how science can help me understand the world, and then once I understand the world, how do I take that to the other part? So I think of self as individual and self as community. So once I have it as individual, then how do I take that self to the community?
Yeah. And, we think about, global climate change,
Yes.
and, there was a Yale did that study about looking at, why is it that the science has been around for decades, right? And how come it's not moving people to change their minds, right? And they were saying how emotion needs to be attached to these facts to stick and to change people and transform them. You're very honest, I don't think that just happens. You are clearly, it's such a gifted writer, and that technique, right, of being able to translate scientific research, fact, into narrative and stories that can move people emotionally. I'm just in awe and admiration.
I think early in my career, I also decided something, and that was that I didn't need to try. I think a lot of times as scientists and academicians, we get caught up in trying to impress people with our knowledge. And my parents and family did a great job of me believing them when they said I was smart. So I don't need to go into the world and have other people convince me. The thing that I always want to do is to attract people with enthusiasm. To understand why I'm so enthusiastic, and that happens through stories. And so I have honed that ability, and thank you, I really appreciate that, because it took me a while before I embraced that I was a writer. And so I really appreciate it.
Well, you don't need me to tell you you
Yeah.
are, but it's amazing. And by the way, your teacher, did you get him a copy of this?
Not yet.
Not yet?
I'm going to do it in person.
Good. All the sweeter. I was curious, did the rest of your family read this book and their response to it?
Yeah, so I have the great, I'm going to be able to do a book event in Little Rock soon, but my sister, a brother, the ones that are named in the book, I gave them the opportunity to read it, and I love my sister Renee is the one I was talking about. She's 3 years older than me, and when I was about 2 weeks old, she kept getting in trouble for holding my nose saying talk, talk. So she was waiting for me to be her best friend. We're still best friends. So I had to let her read it, but she's so cute. Even with Lessons from Plants, she'll call me and say, "You gotta hear this." And I said, "Okay." And then she starts reading, and I said, "I think she's reading me my own book. She said, "It's phenomenal." But I think that she and Nicholas and my brother, who's also mentioned in the book, the ones who've already read it, were really touched to see the family stories explained, to see my grandfather come alive in the chapter on Willow, to see. So I think that they've been really, it's been encouraging, because sometimes when you're writing it, it's your perspective, right? And there were a couple sections even before it went in final. I said, Renee, I got to call and make sure I'm not mistelling, your part. So I was able to discuss it with them in a lot of ways. Yeah.
That's another very powerful aspect of your book, the way that your family history intersects with these really important moments, right, in civil rights history, racist violence, the Elaine massacre plays a big role here. Could you talk a little bit more about that intersection between family and those larger events?
So this is where I love to give credit to my editor, Rita Powers. And good writers have really good relationship with editors that help them understand the power of things. And so I had, the original draft, a couple of those places. And Rita is an African-American woman as well. And she said, the thing that's so powerful about those places where you intersect your family story with large African-American historical events is that it makes it clear for people who are willing to accept it that these aren't just history events out there. There are people walking around who this is their history. Their lives have been impacted. And it's easy to think that these events are so far away, right? But Ruby Bridges has social media accounts, right? The little girl, Ruby Bridges is on social media. If we had a different government, we would have celebrated in December that was simply 70 years ago that the Montgomery bus boycott. Like 70 years. There may be people in here who are almost 70 years old. And when you think about people being impacted by the vestiges of chattel slavery, cotton, and all of that, you don't think about it being someone's mother who I just talked to this morning, right? And so I think the personal stories help us understand how recent this history is, but also how the history that we sometimes are hesitant to engage is still impacting people every day in their daily lives, right? This isn't in the book, but a mere 4 years ago, before I left Michigan State, I had been on the faculty there for almost 20 years. I was an endowed chair. This is a highly prestigious professor, and I was in the building late at night, and I was reported. They said there's a Black woman in the building. The custodian is never with her cart. I see her all the time in the building, and she's never with her cart. So I said, who are we talking about? And then the director said, I think it's you. And so my point is, I was like, I wasn't with my cart because my cart is a chemical cart that but I think that personal stories connected with history help us understand the deep impact. And one of the things that I think is central to my writing, whether it's Lessons from Plant or this book, is that I try to find ways to help people engage in difficult topics without our defenses going up. And sometimes the personal stories, my mother is 84, and so another 84-year-old might be able to identify with her, and so the personal stories. Now, I was resistant to it initially because I've never wanted to write any version of a memoir. I'm private to a fault, right? But I then came to understand that the vulnerability of sharing those stories is important, but also some of the stories, if I can share, you mentioned Elaine, Arkansas. So in the Willow chapter, there's a story about Elaine, Arkansas that I didn't even know about until 2019. I was in Michigan. There was a story on the news that a willow tree, a memorial willow tree that was commemorating a 1919 event in Elaine, Arkansas, where there had been an anti-Black massacre. There were many of them across the U.S., such that summer is known as the Red Summer. And they said that this event happened in Elaine, Arkansas, and there was this memorial willow tree. So I'm in Michigan, I hear Arkansas and tree, and of course I'm interested in the story. As I start to read it, I remember that my grandfather was born in Elaine. So I called my mom and said, when was he born? And she said 1914. So that took me down a genealogical and historical trail, and we realized that though he had never talked about it, though me and my siblings had never heard about this massacre as we were educated in the public schools, that my grandfather was a 5-year-old in this town when there were either 200 to 1,000 black people killed. And so at that time, in 2019, when I learned about this, my son was 6. So I'm watching him play around and thinking what my grandfather endured. And but for my interest in willow trees and hearing the name of this town, this is a history that most of my family didn't know he was a part of. And you know, there were some historians who were studying this in Arkansas, but it wasn't a widely known. People knew about Tulsa and other, but not this. And so it's the worst massacre to ever happen in Arkansas, and most people didn't grow up knowing about it. And so for me, that was a great example of how trees, personal stories, and African American history at large are tied up in our lives in ways that if we confront it, we can then ask ourselves, now what? And part of my now what was sharing it, you know, so that we can be aware of it.
And I confess, I did not know about that
Yes.
until I read.
Yes, and not surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you talk about the Rock 9.
Yes.
Your connection
Yes.
there, but also that visceral reaction your mom has to the tour you gave her to
Yes.
Indiana and the cotton plant.
Yeah, so that must have been around 2001 or 2002. I had gotten my first professional job. So I had finished my PhD and was doing what's known as a postdoc, which is like this short apprentice period before you become a professor. I was so proud. I was at Indiana University in Bloomington. My parents came up for a visit, and I said, I'm going to take you on a tour of the building. The building had an attached greenhouse, and so my parents, plant lovers, are having the time of their life. We're going from room to room, and my father loves heat. We get to the cactus room, he was so excited. And as we're going through, we're all having a great time. And then at one point, my mom had gotten quiet, and I looked at her, and she was like, she had seen a ghost. And so I said, like, what's going on? And she said, she pointed over her shoulder and said, I don't ever need to see that again. And it was a cotton plant with cotton bolls on it. And so it took her back to this history. And I remember she was standing there rubbing her hands. And at some point I realized that she used to talk about how at the end of cotton season her hands would just be scarred up. And so in that moment, it was, my mother she's only 4'11", but she's a mighty little thing and a stoic person. And so to see a plant evoke all of that in her just really led me to think about how deeply impacted she had been with her upbringing. And that just, you know, it's hard to explain that moment. It impacted her the whole day. At the time I was married, and we had dropped my then husband off to play soccer, and when we got home, she was quiet. And he said to me, what did you do? I said, I didn't, why is it always me? I'm okay, we know, okay. But it's like, I didn't do anything this time, right? She saw a cotton plant, and he is from Uganda, and so that wasn't his history. And she just started to say to him, I don't ever need to see that again. And I think that there are few things that we can think of in the world that you could imagine a wide swath of the population having that kind of reaction. And you'd be surprised the number of friends I have. Yeah, my parents grew up in the South, and they too, you know, kind of had that experience. And that was deeply impactful for me. It was one of the reasons why, when I started to write the book, I said, I know cotton's not a tree, but I can't write a book that is in any way about plant history and not pull cotton in because of my family's deep impact it's had on my family.
When you talk about that complicated nature of trees and plants as memorials,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
There's, you know, your book inspired me to think a lot about the tree of Buchenwald concentration camp
Yes.
that I write about.
Yes.
You know,
Beautiful.
the Germans, thank you, Germans, you know, saw it as the German oak as the sign of power. The prisoners saw it as a sign of the outside world. It was associated with the home. It was also a place where people were tortured. But you talk about, you know, navigating that complicated territory when it comes to Black Americans' relationships to plants and trees that have these associations.
It is complicated in a way, right? Like, from that moment I was just talking about, I've always wanted to protect my mother from seeing cotton, right? I just kind of never wanted her. And yet I think back to my interaction with the McLeod oak was so powerful that it led me to explore all of this and share this. And so there is this kind of complex relationship that came to the fore for me in a way. I think it was last year. In fact, I had to do last minute edits because I don't know if you all remember, but I think it was last year that Nottoway plantation set on fire. So this was a plantation that the big house basically burned down, and there were very complicated reactions to it if you follow social media. So there were some people saying the equivalent of Malcolm X's, the chickens have come home to roost, right? And then there were a whole swath of people whose lives had been disrupted because this was in particular a plantation that had really leaned into being a tourist site, whereas others have tried to have themselves be an ethical visitation site. So there were lots of people saying my wedding's been ruined, my 50th anniversary, all these things have been ruined. And so there was all of this complicated nature. And I remember at the time I had a conversation. He wrote a public article about it. He's an author as well. Michael, oh my goodness, I know his name. This always happens. He is Michael Twitty. He's he's a culinary historian. But we had a conversation about it because he too has been to former plantations and seen like old cooking tools and other things that have really caused him to write meaningfully about them. And so there is this conundrum of how can we recognize and honor these beings for what they are and not lose sight of that. And that became part of why I found it so powerful to share with people that the trees aren't just living witnesses, they actually hold the breath, right? And so if a tree gets burned down, it's a very complicated thing. And so I think that there are conversations we need to have about what does it mean to have ethical interactions with spaces, recognizing what they are, but not letting them become like the subject of a topic on The Bachelor, right? Where there was this connection with one of the people on The Bachelor, she had been having sorority parties on a plantation, right? And so there's all these ways, but we can't have those conversations because we won't even acknowledge that this isn't something that's just in our past.
I was thinking about that thinking about the Holocaust sites I went to, the controversy over just taking a selfie in one of those camps, right? And here there are people having weddings on the site of this genocidal violence.
Yes.
And it's normalized.
Yes.
Right? And so I thought that was a very important and powerful part of the book. You touched on this already, but I just was thinking about the difference between human-made memorials and organic memorials, the trees, living things, right? And you talked about the difference between those to some extent, but I'd love to hear more about what do trees and nature have to offer us in terms of memorializing these events and educating us.
Well, it's interesting because we do have practices of like planting memorial trees. In fact, the idea of a witness tree has been one boundary about, and I talk about trees testifying because I think to witness something is to see it, to testify is to tell what you saw. And I always believe in the telling. But I think living memorials are powerful in so many ways. One of the things I think a lot about is that the practice of planting a tree at the gravesite was a practice that came over with the enslaved Africans, right? And so any way in which we're able to keep our roots is always something I'm going to celebrate. I mean, it's so much so that in some ways it was like the jumping of the broom at a wedding ceremony. Planting a tree could be something that you could do and the enslaver wouldn't kind of fight against it. It doesn't cost anything to go and find an acorn. But it was such a wide practice that if you go to some former plantation sites and they see groupings of certain trees, willows and sycamores in particular, you might know that that's a place where the enslaved buried their loved ones. But for me, I think the power of it is in understanding that these trees can be a living bridge between the dead and the living, right? And my father has a headstone like anything else, but I also insisted there was a tree. Because I said every time we go there, then we leave a little bit of ourselves with them. And I was a daddy's girl to a fault, so my biggest thing, even though I know all the science and everything, is that he was going to be alone. And he's not a person who wanted to be alone. I said, so we need to leave a tree because we can leave our deposits of ourselves there with him. So I think living things link us in a way that other things don't for me. And I know I'm biased because of the ways that I think about plants, but I think if you start to understand the science, people beyond those like me who are obsessed with plants can start to have an appreciation of what it means to plant a memorial tree for someone.
And you helped me appreciate so many individual trees. They were almost like characters.
Mm.
Right? I mean, you had, I'll just name a few, the Algernon oak, the Emancipation oak, the Angel oak, the Mary oak, the Bedford oak, and then you also talk about a tree in Africa, the tree of forgetting as well.
Yeah, so some of these things I learned myself, not in the context of, I didn't know them before. So I recently, couple years or so ago, I went to West Africa with a friend. We've been friends for years, and she's from Ghana, and she had never taken me. And I said, what kind of friendship is this? So she finally took me, but we visited a few places, and while I was there, I learned about this. So at some of these places, many of you might have heard that in the spaces where enslaved Africans last left the land, there would be like a, the door that you would exit. What's the name of it? Door of no return. Thank you. There's a door of no return. But in this particular part of West Africa, they also had an African oak tree that they called the tree of forgetting. And they would have men walk around it, I think, 7 times, and women walk around it 3 times so that they would forget everything about their life before they got on the ship and went to America. And the thing that really struck me about that is that when you go to the ports on Charleston and on the southeast coast, where probably 40% to 80% of Africans were brought here, on the coast they meet oak trees. And so they were never going to forget walking around the tree as a symbolic thing. But can you imagine one of the last living things you see is an oak tree, and then you see a relative of it, but it's now this very vast, different association. And so for me, I really thought about what it meant for the last view of you is to see as this tree that they use to help you forget, and then you come here to centuries of memories that are fraught in so many ways. So I was really thinking about that on each side.
Well, we're in Iowa, so agricultural state.
Yeah.
It's a big part of your book, talking about Black botanical knowledge and the essential contributions it has made to often unrecognized, unremembered, to contemporary American agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about those contributions, those essential contributions?
Yeah, it's interesting that we're in Iowa because I think even this week is the commemoration for George Washington Carver, which is, if you ask most Americans if they know any Black people associated with plants, his name might come up. And I want, call George's name, I do not. But there are so many other contributions by name or names that we don't know, I think are quite powerful. So you mentioned Antoine. Antoine was not the first. He's been in many other works. The most popular one, I think, is Taya Miles' All That She Carried, where she talks about this Ashley sack, which is a sack they found in a family heirloom from a young enslaved woman, and in that were some pecans. And so that led her to trace this kind of connection. Antoine was the first, an enslaved man who was the first to be able to successfully graft pecan to make commercialized pecan. So the Centennial variety was the first one that really drove the pecan industry. But there are other Africans, many women actually, who contributed to the rice industry in the U.S. In Africa, the women were the ones who were growing the rice, had the most advanced irrigation techniques, and their expertise was so much that they would go to that area to enslave them. And unfortunately, your expertise is documented by how much you were worth. And we know that expertise was important because those women were sold for as much as the healthiest young males, which were usually the highest price. And so there's this, when we think about enslavement in the U.S., our first thing to do is to think about trauma. But as I started to read about this and think about what is my place as a Black botanist, I have made, the team that I work with, we've made some significant scientific contributions, but this interest in going and recovering this Black botanical expertise and bringing it to the public is not something that a lot of plant scientists would do. And so I became fascinated with those kinds of things and asked how could I incorporate them in this work. To call names, if we know names, there were also many, George Washington and other presidents had lots of enslaved Africans that were behind making their apple cider. So they had to be able to grow the apple trees to make the cider. And so there are these names of people who've contributed that we don't know. And I hope that some of them will become as abundant so that George Washington Carver won't have to be alone. I'm obsessed with people not being alone, with someone who's a loner.
And you also honor folks that aren't going down in the history books, like Mrs. Miles.
Oh my, Mrs.
I
Miles.
need to hear, I want to, yeah.
So Mrs. Miles was my mother's best friend who lived 2 doors down. Except I thought Mrs. Miles was my best friend. I didn't know she wasn't my best friend. So from the time I was 2, I learned Mrs. Miles' phone number. Then you couldn't just go to someone's house. There were no ring cameras you had to call. So I would call her and say, Mrs. Miles, Miss Carneal Miles, can I come down? And she would say yes. And so I thought I was so mature because they would let me walk by myself. Now they were literally, that house was there and it was over there and they're standing on the porches. But I would go down and she would make cookies and tea, and it was just me and her. And as the youngest of 5 children, it was rare to have just the captured attention of someone. She bought me my first little ring. But at every Christmas, Miss Miles is talked about in the apple chapter, because every Christmas she would make Christmas bags. Any of you know what's in a Christmas bag? What's in a Christmas bag?
Orange.
An orange, an apple, some nuts, and some candy. And every year you would get that bag. And so I would help her make these bags. I would sneak extra pieces of candy in bags of friends who I liked. But as I came to know, this is a wide-known tradition in African American communities, as well as some other communities. Oh, but Mrs. Miles, she was really, I thought she was my best friend. And when I realized that she was my mother's best friend and just being kind to me, I thought, oh my goodness. And that's when she bought me a ring. And she said, no, you're my best friend too. And I was close to her until she passed away at 89 a few years ago. And I remember the first time I walked Nicholas down there at 2 to get his Christmas bag. It was like full circle. Yeah.
Except when she was doing walnuts, right? You didn't care for, you like the pecans.
I like the pecans. Yeah.
But that's a great example. There's so much, you talk about the trauma in this book, but there's a lot, you also
Joy.
mentioned the purpose of this is joy and celebration of family and friendship and love. And there's so much of that in this book as well. And also a source of hope is Black Botanical Week. It comes up at the end. I'd like you to talk more about that.
So in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there were lots of attempts to ask, how can we recognize Black contributions to the U.S.? That paired with an event that happened in Central Park where a Black birder, Christian Cooper, was birding and a white woman had her dog off leash, and there was this event. So after that, the first week, Black Birders Week started. And the week was simply to say that there are Black people in nature who bird and we want to celebrate that. And then several other weeks emerged. So a couple of friends reached out and said we should do a Black Botanist Week. So I was one of the co-founders of Black Botanist Week. And we really simply wanted to celebrate Black people who love plants. They didn't have to be a professional. And also we wanted to make an opportunity for people who were interested to engage. And so we didn't know what was going to happen. We put up a social media, at that time Twitter, and said, hello, Black Botanist Week. And it was fascinating. We had people engaging with it. But we got to learn a lot. And it was during that week that I first learned about this town in New Mexico where apples were central to Black people founding the first free town in New Mexico. And so that was just a week where it was a chance to say, let's just celebrate. It was so fun. We had little 4-year-old baby botanists posting their little vegetables that they were growing. And so it was really a week to celebrate, to share knowledge, and those things all together really helped me appreciate sharing this knowledge with the public.
Well, that's a great example also of what I think makes your book distinct also within the nature writing tradition. Because you know that tradition is, primarily, the lonely white guy out in the wilderness, right? He's, distanced himself from family and friends, romanticization of that. Your book, others, I think in Camille Dungy and others are pushing against that, and community as being a part, family being a part, gardening as being a part of that tradition. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I could keep talking up here myself, but I want to open it up to you all if you have some questions for Beronda.
I've never, first of all, I really respect what you do.
Thank you.
I love trees.
Thank you.
I've never heard of a McLeod oak.
Yes.
Is it a live oak?
It is a southern live oak.
A live
Yeah,
oak.
so these are, unlike the oaks that are deciduous that you're used to, that drop all their leaves, they pretty much keep their leaves, and when the new leaves come out, they kind of force the other leaves off. So it's one of the southern live
Yeah,
oaks.
yeah.
It's beautiful.
They just cut, in my apartment yard, they cut down this incredible, beautiful oak. I didn't think they needed to cut down.
Oh,
I don't know why they, I don't know.
that reminds me, I'm looking at, one of my former coworkers will know that, when I was at Brunel, administrator there, I was in my office one day and I heard a saw, a buzz saw. And I was like, I looked out, I was like, what's going on? And they were cutting down a tree that I didn't think needed to be cut down. I had such a reaction that I remember like a couple weeks later, we got a call, there's gonna be a tree cutting on campus. So that you're aware, because I was just like, well, I think I had the legal meeting and somebody got somebody on the phone. I said, those trees could have been moved. So sometimes I think,
I felt the same way.
yes, yes.
And the guy-
Anyway, I made it about me, but I looked over there and saw you, and I remember that day. I was like, oh
Well,
my.
the tree guy was out there, and I went out there, and I was looking at the, was this, the base was this big.
Yeah.
I said, he didn't know why they wanted to cut down, but I said, well, that thing's gotta be 150 years old, and he says, try 250.
That's even more.
Like-
Yeah, those are beautiful trees. This was here?
Yeah.
In Iowa?
Yeah.
Yeah, the angel, the Montgomery oak is still there. One of the ones that I love the most is the angel oak. And if you ever get to go to Charleston, don't leave without, it is the size of half a football field.
Wow.
And it has resurrection ferns, so if it's a moist day, it has all these beautiful resurrection. Oh my, yeah, it's beautiful. Oh, I'm sorry.
Took away my shade. I sat out there and read books all day long. It's gone.
There's a question in that.
And you might have, I might have missed it if you already addressed it. How did you go about selecting the specific trees that you were writing about in this book?
Yeah, so I started with a collection of ones that are kind of, if you ask anyone who's familiar with the African American history of trees, they would expect to see poplar, strange fruit. You would expect oak because there's so many of them in the South. Sycamore is one that is also well known. So there's a well-known song called The Drinking Gourd that you might see in movies where they would sing it. Sycamores are the ones that when their bark kind of slops off, it's kind of white. So when the moon shines on it, you would actually be able to see it and it would help you escape. So those are ones that were kind of expected. Willow came because of this family connection that I discovered. And then apple came because of what I was starting to share about finding that it was connected with this first found in Blacktown, New Mexico. But also I found from someone sending me a children's book called Apple for Harriet Tubman, that Harriet Tubman actually had a great love for apple trees. And so it was a way for me to bring in some well-known people in ways that people don't think about. And so it kind of started there. Mulberry is one that I put in because a lot of people don't know. There are mulberry roads, I think, at Monticello, one of the presidential, but mulberry marks an interesting history in the U.S. when we thought we were going to have a silk industry. And so mulberry was brought in for that. But they used, I'm smiling at, I'm going to tell you why it doesn't sound appropriate. They used small African-American children to help harvest it because their hands were small. And this is one of the times that Renee called me and said, all children have baby hands. Why just our children's baby hand? I said, okay, Renee, let's go to therapy. Let's work this out. But yeah, so there's some interesting facts. But that's kind of how it came together in terms of the trees that were included. Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
for
you.
sharing your stories. Is there an Iowa tree, or do you have an Iowa tree that you recommend we visit?
So I was introduced to a few. Now, to be quite honest, there are lots of fabulous trees on the Grinnell campus. And one of the reasons that when I was, when I interviewed there, it was during COVID, so everything was video, and then I got to come to campus. The fascinating thing about the trees is that it's one of the concentrated places where you can still see the impact of the derecho that came through and how they're recovering from that. But there are a couple of trees in Iowa City that are quite fascinating in terms of how they're growing. I'm still exploring a lot of the trees. You know, my first couple of years in Iowa, I pretty much explored my office and all the work that I was doing. But there are a few here, yeah.
I could speak some entertaining facts to that. There's been a competition over the oldest oak in Iowa, and some DNR nerds all want that honor, and if you Google it, it's really funny. But I was up at Voss State Park where they're restoring the oak savanna and using the Green Corps to pull scrub trees away from this magnificent beast, which is very close to us that you can see. And there's also a legendary 400-year oak in Pamela State Park in Madison County. And right in Beaverdale, down the street from the bookstore, there is a legendary neighborhood friend of maple tree that you go,
It's beautiful. There are also some beautiful trees up in the Decorah area that are, because of the way the land has developed there, that are a little unique.
We'd be remiss not to add that we're in a place of trees, and inside the garden here in the dome, they have what's called the traveling tree, which is a type of palm that would gather water, and often travelers didn't have any other access to water, and it sticks up and kind of looks, the fruit body, the flower looks like a bird of paradise, but if you would see that, it's right in the middle of the dome, and people from miles away would walk to that tree for the water when they were traveling, because the rainforest doesn't actually have a lot of rain that you gather. You have to wait for it or find that tree.
I think that's so good because we sometimes take that for granted, don't we? We think this tree's been around for 300 years and we don't need to take care of it, we don't need to preserve it, protect it. The oldest tree in Nebraska that just passed away, the wolf tree, it's 400 or 500 years old.
Oh, wow.
Because of drought, because of environmental factors. So we need to recognize and protect those trees.
Thank you for that question. Yes?
Do you think you could expand your researches to trees in other countries?
I have. So I don't know if it's the next book, but I'm going to do a diaspora book. So I wrote an article. I was thinking about it because of what you just said. When I was in Ghana, I finally hiked to this forest where they have a canopy walk up, and I saw a tree there. It's called an umbrella tree. And it is a tree where they would walk to it because it has aerial roots that you can see above ground. If you strike them at night, you can get potable water. And it's used for other things. And so I wrote an article really talking about it for us to think about what are the umbrella trees in our communities where people go for healing, for water. But I also, as I was saying, my partner's from Jamaica. I spent quite a bit of time in Jamaica, and there's about a 200-year-old cotton tree there that barely survived Hurricane Melissa. And so I have some things to say about that tree, but there are other species of trees in the Caribbean and Africa that are really quite fascinating in terms of how they're part of community, but the stories they have to tell. My son says I just want to use this because I'll get a fellowship that will allow me to travel to visit these trees. Children know their parents, but I will bring the knowledge back to the community. Yes?
I'm curious to know the recent research and things that have been written about the way trees communicate underground. And I love thinking about the metaphor of what we see above ground and what possibly could be going on below ground. How do you see that kind of mixing or marrying with what you're learning about trees?
Yeah, I wrote about that to some extent in Lessons from Plants, about this kind of underground. So it was a lot of attention to it from books like Susan Simard's Finding the Mother Tree. And certainly trees underground, their roots can get close and touch, but they're also connected by fungi, which are these mycorrhizal webs. And I use that as an example of how, being in a community where you're amongst diverse organisms that have different strengths, that it really does result in your having a stronger existence if you can communicate. And so I look at these as real lessons, but also, as you said, metaphorical lessons for us. And we are often cutting ourselves off in ways that we don't have that shared communication. And in some cases, that's the only ways that plants survive. they don't survive well in isolation, which is why sometimes if you have a certain kind of species in your house in a pot and then you see it, it's like, well, you took me away from all the people I need to talk to. And it's very powerful. I did talk about that a lot in one of the chapters of that book. And I think I've written about, I always write books and then I write articles that are freely available because I need people to get this knowledge and use it. I mean, I appreciate the acknowledgement of my writing, but I write for a purpose. And so, yeah, I think there's some really powerful lessons in that I wish we would get now.
I'm telling you what, that Lessons from Plants taught me so many lessons.
Thank you.
And I just think of it, one of the metaphors you use in there is about when we plant a plant and we look at it and we baby it. We never say to that plant, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
We ask ourselves, what can we do? And oh my goodness, if we took that thinking into our lives more, we would be such a kinder society.
You know, that lesson, whenever you write a book, sometimes you don't know which part of it's going to resonate most with people. That particular lesson that humans interact with plants from an expectation that they should grow, and if they don't, you intervene, has been powerful from 4-year-old to 80-year-olds. I got a letter, I did something with a 4-year-old community. I have a 4-year-old community in Michigan that I was involved with, and I was there, and they invited me back as a trusted friend. But I got a letter from a mother who said that she said, you have transformed my kid's relationship. What do you want? I will get you whatever you want. She said, because she says now the sister is saying to the brother, what do you need? You know, what is it that you need? She said, I have to take them back to the book. But I love that. And I didn't know that would resonate so deeply with people. As I said, a lot of these are just things I'm like, it's a plant fact. And they're like, no, stop. But that is a powerful one. It transformed the way I am as a teacher, a mentor, a neighbor, because I don't look at people as problems first. I ask, is there something missing that you need, and can we try to find it?
It pushes against that traditional way of looking at nature as only survival.
Yes, absolutely.
Competition, violence, domination.
And there's some of that.
There is some of that. You talk about that with,
there's some of that.
With trees, but they also model a specificity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They can teach us how to be better humans.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. This was such a joy. The book came out yesterday, so I was really thrilled to be able to have an event here in what I call home now. And I thank you guys so much. I love this botanical garden, so it's a special gift. And John, thank you. What a joy. Thank you.